You know what? Sometimes life hits you so hard you don't even see it coming. Like a punch you can't dodge, no matter how fast you try. That's exactly how Charles Morgan felt that Saturday afternoon, standing in front of a cracked, faded apartment door with an eviction letter in his pocket, about to sign away something he didn't even know he had. Charles wasn't new to evictions. As the head of a sprawling real estate empire in Lagos, he'd spent years treating people as numbers, missed payments, overdue notices, cold transactions on a glowing screen. But that day, Unit 7B didn't feel like just another data point. Something about it tugged at the back of his memory, like a song you can't quite place. So instead of sending a faceless official, Charles delivered the letter himself. Elsewhere, Karen Mitchell, sharp, elegant, and used to having her way, was losing patience at a bustling market queue. She wasn't accustomed to being told no, especially not by someone like Mary Okafor, a woman in worn clothes, holding her place in line with quiet dignity and unshakable calm. That brief encounter bruised Karen's pride more than she'd ever admit, but instead of fading, the feeling dug in like a thorn. Later that evening, Karen lounged in Charles's luxury apartment, swirling red wine in a crystal glass, her smile tight and calculated. "There's this woman in one of your older buildings," she said, Mary Okafor, rude, unpleasant. "People like her don't belong in our world." Charles only half listened. He'd learned to filter Karen's bitterness, but then she added, "Her boy lives in 7B. That made him pause. Curiosity, or maybe guilt, got the better of him. Karen's casual evening jog slowly turned into quiet surveillance. She watched Mary from a distance, followed her down streets she'd never walked before, and one night saw the boy clutching Mary's hand as they returned home. Something about that child, his face, his walk, gnawed at Karen. She couldn't explain it, but it unsettled her deeply. The next morning, Charles navigated streets far from his polished towers and penthouses. The neighborhood buzzed with life. Noisy, chaotic, alive in a way that made him feel strangely small. He knocked on the door to 7B, and when Mary answered, something inside him froze. She stood calm, eyes alert, clothes simple but neat. And then he saw the boy behind her, a mirror image of himself at that age, down to the small dimple on his left cheek. "I'm here about the eviction," he said, his voice tighter than he meant. Mary didn't flinch. She invited him in, offered tea, but her posture made it clear she owed him nothing. The apartment smelled like boiled rice and menthol rub, modest but warm. A life carved out with resilience. Then she handed him a worn envelope, yellowed, corners soft with time. Inside, a letter she'd written over a decade ago, a story he had never heard, because he vanished before she could tell it. How they'd met at university, how she discovered she was pregnant, how she searched for him but found nothing. She'd raised their son alone. Charles read it in silence, the weight of 11 lost years crashing over him like a wave. His name was Precious. He had a heart condition. The surgeries had drained her. The boy's laughter masked exhaustion. And Charles? He hadn't even known her last name. He left the apartment that day wordless, the eviction notice burning in his pocket like poison. That night, the city of Lagos pulsed on around him, loud and indifferent, as if nothing had changed, except everything had. Charles found himself in a dim bar hours later, staring at the letter. How had he missed this? The boy, the suffering, the silence. The next morning, he showed up at his cousin Solomon's door, unshaven, hollow-eyed. "If someone handed you back 11 years of your life, would you take it?" he asked. Solomon's mouth fell open as Charles told him the truth. "I almost signed my own son's eviction." The shame, thick and unbearable, sat between them like a wall. Karen, ever watchful, noticed the shift in him. The late nights, the absence, the haunted look. One night she found the letter tucked inside his jacket. Jealousy and rage ignited like gasoline. This woman, Mary, the same one who'd embarrassed her in public, now had Charles's full attention. Karen's response was simple: control it or destroy it. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Charles watched Precious struggle through another cardiac episode. Machines beeped. Mary's hand trembled as she smoothed her son's hair. Her exhaustion seeped from every pore. Charles said nothing, but the next day, he personally crossed out the eviction order. No press release, no PR spin, just a red line. A start. He began visiting more quiet dinners, school drop-offs, not as a mogul, but as a man trying to show up. Mary kept her guard high. "Don't think a few meals change everything," she warned. But there was a softness growing too. Precious returned to school, but whispers followed him. "Your dad didn't want you," one boy sneered. It cut him deep. Charles heard it and froze. He had built towers, signed billionaire deals, but he couldn't shield his son from those 6 words. Karen escalated. She leaked medical files, stirred gossip, told investors Charles was hiding a scandal. Emergency board meetings followed. Cold stares, soft betrayals. When questioned, Charles stood tall. This child didn't ask for any of this, he said. My silence wasn't shame. It was protection. Some nodded, others looked away, but a shift had begun. At the Business Impact Awards, Charles arrived not with a trophy, wife or business partner, but with Mary and Precious. Cameras clicked. Whispers spread. He took the podium. Success isn't how far you rise. It's who you take with you. The applause was polite, but the only one that mattered came after, when Precious whispered, "You were amazing, Daddy." Outside the gala, Karen intercepted Mary. Her voice was sugar-laced poison. You think you've won? He'll get bored. They always do. Mary didn't flinch. Her smile was calm. Power without peace is just noise, she replied, and walked away. Karen's schemes didn't stop. But Charles didn't waver either. Slowly, the pieces of a family, shattered by time, pride, and silence, began to fit together. Charles cooked dinners, clumsy, burnt, but real. Precious laughed. Mary watched him, cautious but warming. She returned to work, faced judgment, proved her worth. Time lost can never be reclaimed, but presence, daily steady, can heal what silence once ruined. True fatherhood isn't wealth or words. It's showing up day after day. And though storms still gather, Charles no longer runs. Because this isn't just about business or image. It's about family, redemption, and learning to stand in the light.
So what do you think?
When it comes to responsibility and forgiveness, where do you draw the line? Is Charles too late or just in time? And what about Karen? Is she the villain or just another player in a ruthless world? Drop your thoughts below. Let's talk about loyalty, justice, and what family really means. 2 months had passed since Charles crossed out the eviction notice with a red pen that felt heavier than any boardroom decision he'd ever made. In those weeks, he had entered a world far removed from polished floors and pressed suits, a world filled with sticky fingers, late-night fevers, modest dinners, and awkward silences. And yet there was something sacred about it. Precious had started calling him Dad, shy at first, like testing out a word he wasn't sure would hold. And Mary, though still cautious, began to laugh in his presence, small, brief laughs that felt more valuable than his entire estate portfolio. But peace, as Charles had learned, never comes without a price. Karen wasn't done. She watched from the shadows of elite events and charity galas, lips tight behind her champagne glass. She had spent years building a life with Charles, not just a relationship, but a future with status and power. And now, it was crumbling under the weight of a woman she saw as nothing, a forgotten chapter he didn't even know he'd written. Her fury wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Karen knew the cost of perception. In their world, reputation was more fragile than truth. She sent anonymous emails to journalists. Rumors turned into headlines. Real estate tycoon hides love child in slum apartment. Shareholders panicked. Charles was summoned to an emergency board meeting. Is this story accurate? One of the directors asked sternly, eyes locked on Charles across the table. Charles didn't flinch. My personal life is no secret, he said calmly, but my silence protected the only people in this story who matter, my son and his mother. If that makes me less of a CEO in your eyes, so be it. There was a pause. Then a quiet voice from the end of the table said, makes you more of one in mine. Outside, Charles didn't even stop to celebrate the small victory. He had more important places to be. That evening, Mary stood on the porch of 7B holding Precious's latest scan results. Her face was unreadable. When Charles approached, she handed them to him without a word. The second surgery is no longer optional, she said. It's urgent. Charles didn't hesitate. I'll cover everything. Mary met his eyes. Not just the money. I need you there, in the hospital, when he wakes up. When he asks for you. I'll be there, he said without blinking. But the hospital came with its own ghosts. As Precious lay sedated, surrounded by wires and machines, Charles sat beside him, whispering stories from his own childhood, stories he'd never told anyone, about skipping rocks by the river, about the first time he saw his father cry. Precious didn't move, but the monitor beeped steadily. Charles held that rhythm like a lifeline. Mary stayed nearby, never too far, but never clinging. She had raised this child through fire. She wasn't ready to give him away, not to fate, and not to a man still learning how to be one. Karen showed up at the hospital once, uninvited. She wore a trench coat and sunglasses like she was shielding herself from pity. Mary met her in the hallway before she could step inside. What do you want? Mary asked, voice steady. You think this is love? Karen snapped. He's guilty. That's all. Guilt fades. Mary didn't answer right away. She looked at the hospital room's glowing door. No, she said softly. But love doesn't. Karen left without another word. The surgery was long. Hours that stretched like days. Charles prayed, not with words but with breath. With presence. When the doctor finally emerged with tired eyes and a soft smile, Mary broke down. For the first time in front of him. He's okay, the doctor said. He's going to need time. But he made it. Charles sat beside Precious the next morning as the boy opened his eyes. Hey, champ, Charles whispered. You didn't leave, Precious said, voice barely above a breath. I won't, Charles promised. In the weeks that followed, something unspoken settled into place. Charles didn't move back into his high-rise. Instead, he rented a modest flat near Mary's building and showed up every day. School pickups, grocery runs, checkups. Not because he had to, but because he finally understood fatherhood wasn't a role, it was a rhythm. Mary returned to her part-time job, facing judgmental looks and backhanded compliments with the same quiet dignity that once stopped. Karen cold in the market queue. But now she had something stronger, a family that stood beside her. Not perfect, but present. One evening, as the sun set over Lagos and the three of them sat eating jollof, rice together on the tiny balcony of Charles's rental, Mary looked at him and said, You're not the man I met all those years ago. I know, he replied. He wasn't ready. She smiled faintly. And you think you are now? I think I'm trying, he said. Every day. Precious, between bites, looked up and grinned. You both talk too much. They laughed. Not because life was perfect, but because, for once, it felt honest. Charles knew the whispers would never fully fade, that some investors would always see a stain, that Karen might strike again, but none of that mattered anymore. Because in this small, unremarkable apartment filled with second-hand chairs and mismatched plates, he had found something that couldn't be bought, branded, or rebuilt, a second chance.